Thank you for watching and joining us today. You'll be hearing a lot about the connection between autism and acetaminophen, or paracetamol, depending on where you're at, the use of that from conception through to age 5. And no, I am not William Parker. We will meet him in a second. You'll get to hear all about him, as well as a little bit about autism and what it is like right now here in the US, so that we can all start this conversation and hear this fascinating evidence while from the same background. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about autism first, and then I will introduce you to Dr. William Parker. First is that a 2023 statistic came out from the CDC saying that now 1 in 36 children have autism, which is an incredibly high number. As we've looked at it over the course of time, this number, 1 in 36, is 70 times more autism after acetaminophen use became popular back in the 80s. It's been really trending into that curve. And so you'll hear a little bit more about that from Dr. Parker in just a little bit. But really, we just see it rising and rising. And so the question becomes, if in every 5 minutes in the US, a child is diagnosed with autism, why? Where is it coming from? How is this happening? And we believe that this will give you some of that information. And so as we look more into the evidence itself, we see that there's now more than 20 reasons that we know acetaminophen causes autism. And that's really coming down to 90% of all cases of autism, or new cases, I should say, could be prevented with some adjustments. And so really what it comes down to at this point is that we now know that many, if not most, cases of autism are a chemically induced injury, which occurs when babies and children with oxidative stress are given acetaminophen. And so before we dive deep into all the information and all the evidence that we have, let's take a step back and just meet Dr. William Parker, who has lots of accolades and published stories, or published studies, in the course of his long career. So this is William Parker himself, part of WP Lab. His accolades and kind of what he's most noted for starts early. So he's most well known for the function of the human vermiform appendix as a safe house for beneficial bacteria. So one podcaster several months ago was interviewing Dr. William Parker, and she described it like this, which I think is really great. It is basically your good bacteria's backup drive, so that if anything happens to that bacteria in your gut, if it goes down for any reason, it can easily be rebooted and you have access to that good beneficial bacteria. And so that's really it. That's the discovery about the use of the appendix, at least for those of us that are less sciencely connected or science minded, I guess. Then next is the multicellular symbiotic organisms that affect brain function. And so this was a study that he did that is also quite well regarded. As you see here on the screen, this is an article that was published in Men's Health about the immune systems and their mental health and the effect that those have, the correlation between them. And then from there is something that I find very, very amusing. It's something called Immunity in the Wild. And this picture you see here is one that was published in a magazine called Popular Science, depicting Dr. Parker's going out and looking for rats to study. But he was one of the first people to look at the immune systems actually in the wild. And just a few of his numerous papers on this topic are listed here. There are definitely numerous. So if you are interested in this, you should look up a little bit more about him in some of the search engines. You'll get a lot of his studies, I believe in his H-index as well. You can have that listed there. And then from there, he had the opportunity to start working on the question of protein. And these all kind of go into that protein folding back in the late 1980s. And it's still a great interest of his. In fact, one of his high school students that he used to work with made it to the finals in a national science competition. Here he is, and he got to shake hands with then President Barack Obama. And even more recently, his laboratory found that multicellular symbiotic organisms affect brain function itself. And so this work is probably one of his most clinically relevant, but it is quite broad. The breadth of it is extraordinary, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more coming out from him about this. And so finally, he was the first to publicly predict that the clinical impact of COVID would be attributed to develop or attenuated in developing countries due to the presence of multicellular symbiotic organisms. I am going to have that down pat by the time this is over. He won't be discussing any of that research today necessarily, but I think this is a really great overview so that you can understand who he is and really helpful as a presenter himself, his credentials, how much of this all came to be. And so without much further ado, let me introduce Dr. William Parker. So this is Dr. William Parker, part of a visiting scholar at UNC Chapel Hill, CEO of WP Labs, and so much more.
Thank you so much, Rachel.
It is a pleasure to be here talking about the connection between acetaminophen use early in life. Really, we're looking at from conception to about 5 years of age and autism spectrum disorder. I'll generally just refer to that as autism for the duration of this discussion. So I've been in science, it'll be 40 years next year. And this is, I think, to me, one of the most shocking things that I've ever encountered. At the same time, a historical perspective shows that this is not highly unusual. So we'll go through all that. We'll go through all the lines of evidence, and I'll start out and give you sort of a summary of the evidence. But first, you need to know where we're coming from. So I work with a toxicologist and a pharmacologist I have for years. They're on a team. They are industrial scientists that volunteer with our nonprofit organization. We're very, very, very grateful to Doctors Consola and Jones. So they have tremendous amount of experience. More than 25 years ago, Dr. Jones actually published a paper, was a co-author on a paper dealing with the effects of cigarette smoke on neurodevelopment. So it's been in this game a long time, looking at what kinds of things affect a baby's brain. We also collaborate with a number of neuroscientists and other scientists as needed on very specific projects. So all the university professors that we work with, and many of them are shown here, help us with very specific projects. They don't help us with everything that I'm going to talk to you about today, but on an as-need basis, they've been extremely helpful, and we're very, very grateful for our collaborations with the academic community. And I myself have been in academics for more than 35 years now, so quite a while, and it's just an incredible source of just knowledge and brain power. So I'll also tell you just how I got started on this. It's not unusual in science that you're working on one thing and you drift into something else. So as Rachel has mentioned, I had some renown from figuring out what the human appendix, the vermiform appendix, does. So one day somebody called me and said, hey, you're an expert on how the gut functions. You really should look at autism. And I thought, that doesn't, I mean, this is the gut, that I work on, and you're talking about the brain. But back then, this was about 2007, the gut-brain connection wasn't as appreciated as it is today. But I did check into it, and it's quite remarkable how the gut is affected in individuals with autism spectrum disorder. Now, a lot of things made sense because we worked on inflammatory type conditions, everything from allergy and autoimmunity to even some neuropsychiatric problems associated with inflammation, such as depression. But some things about autism just didn't add up. The timing wasn't right in terms of when it appeared in human history. It was discovered in 1920, rediscovered in the 40s by a couple of individuals named Connor and Asperger independently, or somewhat independently. And that's just very late. It should have been discovered much sooner if it was similar to other kinds of inflammatory related conditions. And it was a paper by Stephen Schultz, published in 2008, that really provided a big clue about what's going on. And we'll talk about that bit of evidence as we go through it. So it's very, very exciting to sort of present the overall big picture here. When we first started out, we only had 4 lines of evidence. That was 2015, and they weren't from us. I mean, some of that was from Stephen Schultz. 2 of those lines were from Stephen Schultz. And right now we have 24 lines of evidence. So, and again, we'll go over all of that in great detail. I'll start out and sort of give you a summary of the evidence, and then we'll go in some detail, but still it's going to summarize a lot. So we'll start with a summary of the summary, and then we'll go through all the evidence. Then we'll talk about the conclusions and what should we do about it. What are our recommendations for the medical field? And then, of course, we don't give medical advice, but we can make recommendations for the field of medicine in general. So as I mentioned earlier, things have developed over time. So by 2017, we had 14 lines of evidence that expanded into our current 24 lines of evidence. And some of the more recent evidence, I think, is extremely interesting and helpful, answering some questions, some nagging questions that I had been asked several times. And we'll talk about each one of those lines of evidence and how they address the issue at hand. So there's additional work that we publish, and of course numerous other labs. For example, in laboratory animal studies, I'll talk about work from multiple labs. There's 5 different labs working on this independently, all finding that acetaminophen is not good for a developing brain in those laboratory animals. And most of our evidence comes from humans, though, and I'll talk to you about that in just a minute. So the evidence, as I said, is going to be 24 lines. In the top left of the slide, it'll tell you what line of evidence we're on. And we're going to start out by just thinking about overall, what does this body of evidence do? What does it look like? How does it feel to us as a scientist, if I can use that terminology? Scientists sometimes don't like feelings, but some things can be aggravating to a scientist. And a conspiracy theory is one of those things that can aggravate a scientist because it tends to ignore science. So people have studied conspiracy theories in some detail, and there's certain hallmarks of a conspiracy theory. And you can see those right here. So it usually involves a fragile chain of logic with some of the evidence being hidden or unavailable for some reason. And it doesn't involve a lot of scientific evidence all pointing in the same direction. That's what we're looking for when we look for a scientific theory. There's a number of other hallmarks of a scientific theory that don't fit with a conspiracy theory. So what we find is that the prevailing paradigm right now in some circles is that autism is really not increasing. It's just due to increased awareness and a number of other things that you can see in the fine print down there that involve changes in medical practice and destigmatization of autism. But it turns out that that idea has all the hallmarks of a conspiracy theory. It's ignoring so much scientific evidence, number one. And number two, when you try to find evidence for that in the literature, you can find evidence that, yeah, okay, if you say, for example, increase funding for autism in a certain area, the diagnoses will go up, but that's a very short-term kind of thing. We're looking at increases that occur over a 40-year period, and we can say a lot about what's happened in that 40-year period, and very little of that over that 40-year period is accounted for the kinds of changes that we see just with, say, increased funding or increased awareness. We'll go into all that in a little bit of detail, but that only affects really a couple of the lines out of the 24 lines of evidence. So it's not even critical for the theory. But again, we'll go over everything. So it turns out that what I will talk about today, which is our conclusion, not even a theory, it's a conclusion, that exposure of susceptible, and it's very important, susceptible babies and children causes many, if not most, cases of autism spectrum disorder. We'll go over all the scientific evidence. All of it has been published. I think I'll show you one slide from unpublished data, but it's not a separate line of evidence by itself. So the next 3 slides are going to kind of summarize what our evidence is, what kind of evidence is it, and a lot of it is an association in time, space, or an association with certain behaviors. And by behaviors, I mean things that humans do. So for example, circumcision. There's a study and we'll talk about the study in a little bit of detail, that shows a 2-fold increase in infantile autism associated with circumcision. So that is a fascinating study. People just don't like to believe it. If you look at some reviews that are talking about that study, they'll just dismiss it. It basically can't be right. But then there's no real reason to dismiss that. And when you put it together with all the other 23 lines of evidence I'm going to show you, it actually makes perfect sense. So we don't have to dismiss scientific evidence to make our theory fit, which is, again, a hallmark of a conspiracy theory. So if you look at and again, we'll go over all these in detail, and this is just a schematic diagram. It doesn't show you all the evidence, but the circumcision connection there on the bottom right, that's the bottom right leaf. If you look 2 up from that, that's the Schultz study that was published in 2008. It's very, very convincing. Again, it's been dismissed by a number of investigators, and we have looked at that study in great detail and analyzed that study. And basically what it shows is that for parents who think that their child's autism was caused by a vaccine, it was in fact the acetaminophen associated with the vaccine, not the vaccine itself. And that again, that's work by Stephen Schultz published in 2008. We'll talk about that. So the bottom line here is that all of these things come together with a common denominator, and here it's called APAP, that's N-acetyl-para-aminophenol, or acetaminophen, or paracetamol, as it's called in many places outside of the United States. So APAP, you'll see it in a lot of the slides. It's a way we abbreviate acetaminophen using its chemical name. So that's the common denominator between, for example, circumcision, other things such as infection that are associated with autism spectrum disorder. And before I move on from this slide, scientists understand that associations don't equal causation. At the same time, if you've got multiple associations with only one common denominator, first, and second, with no alternative explanation, and third, with multiple other lines of supporting evidence, then you can draw conclusions from that, and we have. So we'll go through every single one of these. Now, the field of toxicology medicine actually does provide us with a lot of information, and we'll go through each one of these little leaves represents a different line of evidence that we're going to cover that in this case comes from toxicology and medicine. So if the left third leaf from the bottom, never proven safe, that's a big indicator. We had to go through the literature and prove that nobody ever actually looked to see if the drug was safe for neurodevelopment. And when we do, we find, and you'll see in the next slide with animal studies, it never would have passed current guidelines for FDA testing, even enough to be used experimentally in a baby. And one of the interesting lines of evidence, I'm just going to point out 2 examples here. We'll go into detail later. For example, is the effect of metabolic deficiency in cats and domestic cats. And every veterinarian knows you cannot give a cat acetaminophen. It is dangerous for them. And the reason why is because they're deficient in a certain metabolic pathway that makes acetaminophen dangerous. It turns out newborns are also deficient in that pathway. That's been known for decades, and nobody connected the dots. So the toxicology and medicine tell us a lot. The associations are basically telling us that acetaminophen has opportunity if we think sort of kind of a criminal investigation. So there's opportunity because all these associations are there. Acetaminophen is there when autism happens, and autism is apparently not there when acetaminophen is not there. So there's opportunities there, and that what the toxicology and medicine are telling us is that it has the motive. For example, you see here there's an effect on social awareness in adults. It's been documented by several reports. What it's telling us is that acetaminophen does somehow affect social awareness even in adults, and that's a temporary effect in adults. But then if you see that same effect, and that's a hallmark of autism spectrum disorder, is a deficit in social awareness. So that's extremely concerning. And again, looking at all this together, there's no question as to what's going on. And historically, we'll see this is not an unusual case, not an especially unusual case. So the toxicology of medicine is very important. And then we'll go on and talk about laboratory animal studies. I think one of the big things with laboratory animal studies, it explains why autism is mostly affects males. Females are not as affected to the degree that males are. And that's what we see both. I say we, it's not my laboratory, but other laboratories have seen both in mice and in rats that the effect on males is greater than the effect on females. So when you put all this together, there's a principle known as Occam's razor, the simplest solution. And there's a very simple solution for all of this, which is that acetaminophen exposure in susceptible babies and children. So you got two elements. You got susceptibility, which is defined by a mixture of genetics and epigenetics and environmental factors. All of these things that we know are associated with autism, plus acetaminophen will cause autism spectrum disorder. So that's a simple explanation, and you've got to do a lot of work to explain all the evidence that I will show you today if you want to dismiss our conclusions and say, no, acetaminophen could not be the problem. So there's a corollary to it comes from Occam's razor, which is so the simplest explanation that explains the observations is usually correct. And the corollary that we've devised is a quasi-quantitative corollary that the bigger the difference, I mean, if you've got a super simple explanation, and I'm just going to say a super complex explanation that involves trying to explain away literally dozens or more studies, then this much simpler explanation is much more likely to be true. So there's sort of, if there's only small differences in complexity, Occam's razor would still apply, but it wouldn't apply as strongly, shall we say. So, and that's exactly what we see. There's so big of a difference between the conclusions that we've reached and any kind of alternative explanation that it gets to the point of being ridiculous. And we'll go into every single bit of this and show you the peer-reviewed literature. This book just recently came out, and one of the things the author talks about, he's a New York Times best-selling author, it's a surgeon at Johns Hopkins University, is the problem with acetaminophen. So, and he cites our paper where we showed it was never proven safe. And unfortunately, just in medicine, sometimes we have a blind spot. And I'll show you that in autism research that has classically, it's just been a series, literally piggybacking on top of each other of sort of blind spots and missed opportunities. And this is yet another one, the connection between autism spectrum disorder and acetaminophen. So I'll start out now. We're going to go ahead and jump in. I've given you a summary of all the evidence, and now we're going to go into the individual lines of evidence. So piece of evidence number one is that the mechanism makes sense. Now, no one single piece of evidence, I mean, well, some of them are extremely convincing, but no one by itself would convince us without reasonable doubt, as we are today, convinced without reasonable doubt that acetaminophen is doing this. So this is a very interesting line of evidence. And you can see that in this diagram, there are different pathways in APAP again. It's acetaminophen. It gets metabolized into different components. And most physicians know that with acetaminophen, a certain amount of it is going to make a very toxic metabolite it's a quinonamine. It's called NAPQI, or some people call it NAPQI. So most people can just process that away. It's not a problem for most adults. And unfortunately, in children with autism, there's some pathways that are shown in this diagram in green, and those are safe pathways. They're non-toxic pathways by which your body can process things. And the glucuronidation pathway, that's the one I mentioned earlier in domestic cats, is deficient. It's also deficient in newborns. The other problem here is that the two other green pathways, sulfation and the glutathione-dependent pathways, those don't work very well in many people with autism. It's children with autism have deficiencies in those pathways, and especially with the sulfation pathway, that's been known since the 1990s. So we've known these things for a long time, but nobody connected the dots. So what happens when you block all those green pathways is you end up with that red pathway, which is the toxic pathway. So this is the sort of the means out of the means, motive, and opportunity that acetaminophen does have the means to cause cellular damage. And we'll show you later that we know that it affects the brain by several different, numerous lines of evidence are telling us that in adults, it gets the liver, and in babies, it gets the brain. And it's not surprising. Babies are not just small adults. That's been known since the 1950s, but it was just not taken into account when it was decided that this drug is safe for babies and children. So our line of evidence number 2 now is there's so many things that are associated with autism, and it turns out they all cause something called oxidative stress, which affects that glutathione pathway that I showed you in the last slide. It prevents safe metabolism or retards, diminishes safe metabolism of acetaminophen, driving things back into that red pathway shown in this diagram. So all of these things, and it's genetic, it's epigenetic, it's environment. For example, plastics, antibiotics, a number of genetic conditions, including Down syndrome, so many things that make acetaminophen more dangerous. And I'll show you some more in subsequent slides. So this is a second line of evidence. I think we want to do an illustration here to really show you how this works. So if we imagine that our body's ability to handle chemicals is a certain amount and represented by these 2 cups, but one of those cups is 2 different individuals represented here. One of those cups has already some of its space taken up, maybe a genetic condition that one of their enzymes isn't quite working as well as the average person's enzyme to safely metabolize acetaminophen. Then they get sick, so they have an infection. That's a bit more space that's taken up, and they have antibiotics. Maybe they can't keep down solid food, so that's causing some problems. So part of their capacity is gone, and then we're just going to add some great flavored acetaminophen, liquid acetaminophen to this, and what we find is that if we keep adding that acetaminophen in, sure enough, that the one with diminished capacity is going to have problems first. And this is just a simple illustration of how acetaminophen adds in with all of those other things that I showed you on the previous slide to cause neurological damage during development. So the third line of evidence is one of 2 lines of evidence that comes from the Schultz study, and it has been widely dismissed because, well, if you think, hey, this just can't be real, then we humans can find a way to dismiss things. It's called a confirmation bias. It's just classic human behavior. But if you look at those dismissals, there's no scientific substance to them. Right? There was a bias in the selection of individuals from this. Most likely they thought that vaccines were causing their child's regressive autism. And what you find here is that in the Schultz study, if children were given acetaminophen, they're 20 times more likely than children who are not to have regressive autism. So this is not a super conclusive study. You say, wow, that's amazing. Well, it's what we call a case control study. It's not the gold standard, which is a double-blind placebo control. So it's not absolute proof, but it's extremely compelling, and it deals with regressive autism. So this is what happens after months or even years of development when you lose developmental milestones after exposure to acetaminophen. So 20 times more likely to develop regressive autism. So that is a very, very important study. And then another important study is the circumcision study. This one deals with infantile autism that it's assumed, but apparently incorrectly, that people are born with. But it looks like because of the circumcision connection and some other studies that I'll talk about, one especially dealing with cord blood, it looks like the baby is born without autism and then is induced very, very early, even within hours of birth, by acetaminophen exposure during the circumcision process, which is associated with twice as much infantile autism. This study is a Danish study. They use the entire Danish national birth cohort to do this assessment. It's a extremely well done, rigorous study. But again, it's been dismissed. And if you look at those dismissals, it looks like it's a case of, again, confirmation bias. There's no scientific reason to dismiss it. It seems to be just dismissed because people can't believe it's true. And it turns out with circumcision, parents sometimes don't even know, it's not documented in many cases, that the child is given acetaminophen. This is something we pulled off the website of one of the large healthcare systems recently. I mean, any physician involved in that procedure will tell you that in most institutions, they do use acetaminophen with that procedure, even though it's proven not to work for the pain of circumcision. So there's, and this is a separate line. Now we're still talking about circumcision, but we're moving from line of evidence number 4, which is the Danish study, to another link apparently with circumcision, which is that the Orthodox Jewish community, who does not use acetaminophen, but they do circumcise, they do tend to have less autism than Reformed Jews. And there are other explanations for this observation, and there's some explanations for some of the observations that I'll talk about today. But again, there is one simple explanation that fits all the observations. So the Orthodox Jews tend to use a bit of alcohol, not acetaminophen, whereas the Reformed Jews use both. So I mentioned earlier in passing that acetaminophen present at the time of birth, and you can measure that in the cord blood, is strongly associated. The association is large. So the odds ratio is 3.62. If you just divide women in 3 groups, the group with the lowest amount are babies and women, because the cord blood is going to represent the amount of acetaminophen in both the mother, and this is at the time they clamp the umbilical cord, and the newborn child. So you divide babies and women into 3 groups. The group with the highest amount of acetaminophen has almost 4 times the likelihood of having a child with autism than the group with the lowest amount of acetaminophen. So that is extremely telling. And again, we'll talk about the toxicology of this later. The time at birth is the most hazardous time to be exposed to acetaminophen, because before birth, 10 seconds before birth, the mother's liver is still there protecting the child. But then that mother's liver is very efficient. Pregnant women have very efficient livers in terms of metabolizing toxins compared to average people. But as soon as you clamp that cord, then you have a baby there, and the baby's liver is very, very inefficient compared to the average person at metabolizing any kind of toxin, and drugs are metabolized the same as any other toxin. So you're making this huge jump right when you clamp that cord. So, and then of course, if you clamp the cord and the baby's left to metabolize a lot of extra acetaminophen that has been administered to the mother during labor and delivery, and then the baby, for example, gets a dose of acetaminophen with circumcision a few hours later, then that's technically an overdose of acetaminophen. So that's obviously not what you want to have happening at the point in a person's life when they're least able to safely metabolize acetaminophen. And that's probably has a lot to do with this very large odds ratio that you see here in this particular study. So moving along to the next line of evidence, and this one is going to be really interesting to talk about in terms of public perception, I think. So there's a prenatal connection, and by connection I mean there's an association between acetaminophen use and autism spectrum disorder. 14 different studies have been published, 13 of those, as at the time that I put this together initially. There's been a few more studies now. We'll talk about the most recent one in a little bit, but 13 out of 14 of those are showing that there's some connection, but there's some problems with acetaminophen use during pregnancy. So and again, we think pregnancy is not the most dangerous time to get exposed to acetaminophen. Now the studies are controlled, and the controlled issue is interesting, and we'll talk about that in passing. It deals with the statistics of how these things are handled, which are dependent on assumptions that statisticians are told to use when they analyze the data. So they're controlled for the reason that people took the acetaminophen, which is technically wrong. I mean, we'll just put it bluntly, this is a mistake, because the reason why they took the acetaminophen often has to do with the kinds of things that make acetaminophen dangerous. So you can't, in statistics, what's going on is you've got cofactors, things that interact that cause a problem. You can't treat them as what's called confounding factors. And there's no reason to go into great detail. I'll show you a paper later, where in just a couple of slides from now, where we've looked at this in detail, and you can check that paper if you're very interested. But the bottom line is that the way that these studies are done, most of them are still, well, 13 out of 14 are still showing a problem, but they're adjusted in such a way so that the problem is diminished compared to the actual problem that does exist. So no study found acetaminophen to be safe, and the findings are wide range, everything from ADHD to lowered IQ, developmental delays, behavioral problems, and autism spectrum disorder. So the one study that found no problem suggested, but it's not highly powered, but maybe for occasionally treating a fever, that acetaminophen might not be dangerous during pregnancy. So, and heavy use of acetaminophen, though, has essentially always been associated with problems. And I think the next study is a good case in point of that. So there was a study that came out of Spain. This is an example, and here's a misinformation alert. You can see the note up there. What normally has happened in the past, or frequently has happened, I should say, is that when a study comes out and says, hey, this drug is associated with this condition, autism spectrum disorder, somebody will come out and say, well, there's really no reason to be concerned. And in this case, the National Health Service, which is the UK's equivalent of our National Institutes of Health, came out and said, you really don't worry about this study. There's just nothing concrete here. Now, remember, we're talking about one line of evidence out of 24, and everybody seems to be focused on this line of evidence, particularly the media, which is super interesting and super problematic. So these studies are just analyses of large healthcare databases. They're not looking at the toxicology, the pharmacology, the animal studies. They're not thinking about the big picture, the connections that we see with circumcision, with the Schultz study, with the vaccination. So they're very, very limited in scope. And again, they do have problems with the data analysis because they're based on certain assumptions which are known to be incorrect. So in this case, the health service came out with a statement that if you read their statement clearly, you could tell they didn't actually read the paper. It came out within days. It took months and months to put that study together, and it came out within days. And we're looking at study number 8. It was a big response to study number 8, and they didn't even note that, hey, this is not the first study that's come out that says the same thing. You've got 7 other studies that have come out saying the same thing. So it's a kind of, again, confirmation bias. Hey, it's just one study. I wouldn't be concerned about it. But in reality, it's not one study. In reality, they did control for a lot of factors to try to determine, is this really acetaminophen that's doing this? So the one that's in the media right now is, again, this is a study of these healthcare databases. Most of them come from Scandinavian countries where the databases are extremely good, Denmark and Sweden. What they said was that there's no association between autism spectrum disorder and prenatal or use of acetaminophen during pregnancy. But what they actually found was that the odds ratio is 1.8. If you use acetaminophen during pregnancy, 80% more autism if you use acetaminophen during pregnancy. But they mathematically adjusted that out because they corrected for what they call potentially confounding factors. But those are not confounding factors. They're cofactors. We know that based on the toxicology of the drug. We published a proof that that was wrong. That's shown here. You can find that online. It's open access. So everything we publish about this topic is open access and freely available. And it received almost no press. The press release on that one did not make it too far. But it's just math. Right? It's just statistics. It's just math. We have a great team that we work with in analyzing the numbers. And they did not do their math. I say the paper that published in JAMA that we're talking about, which said there's no association between, they said they did what's called a sibling control, but they had already corrected out almost all of the effect even before they did what's called a sibling control. There's a lot of details of this that I'm not going to get into, and there's no reason to here. And you can find those in this paper here. We'll just move on and say the paper is wrong. The association is real, and you can see it in that paper if you look at the data. So the prenatal connection, again, we don't think that's where most of the autism is induced. It's probably right when you clamp that umbilical cord, probably before a baby's taken home from the hospital. Half of or more of the cases of autism are already induced by then. The regressive autism probably accounts for only, which regressive being induced later, probably only accounts for 30 to 50%, depending on the study, of total cases of autism spectrum disorder. And you can get sort of things in the middle. You know, the kids have oxidative stress, which those have its own set of symptoms. So they were susceptible children, which don't necessarily look the same, or there's a lot of things that might be different about susceptible and non-susceptible children. As you keep getting acetaminophen, you know, some at birth and then some later on, you can get a mixed bag. It doesn't have to be just either infantile or regressive. But the regressive, there is a component to that where they do lose some function, some developmental function. All right, so the postnatal connection, there's only, and here again, there's a misinformation alert. There was a study by Alamany, Alamany and colleagues. Alamany is the name of the first author, the last name of the first author. In that, if you read the abstract, it says there's no association found between. Now, they did find a association during pregnancy, but they said during childhood, after pregnancy, there's no association between autism and acetaminophen use, which you say, well, that's different than what Schultz said. But what they did was they only looked at one database that actually had autism in it, and you did see a very big a very substantial association. It was a 30% increase with only 7% acetaminophen use. So that's not very much acetaminophen use, so they missed most of it. We know that acetaminophen use in children is much higher than that, especially in the population they're looking at specifically. That has been evaluated, and we've got a detailed analysis of that published. But the bottom line is they mathematically average that in with, and this study has been criticized, and rightfully so, because you're averaging a lot of things together and cancel out the effect from the acetaminophen. And this is line of evidence number 8. It's only one line of evidence out of 24. If you look at that line of evidence, though, it's solid. It's a good line of evidence. So we will keep it in the study. But you have to read past the abstract. The abstract, it doesn't reflect actually what they saw in the paper. It's just a very interesting situation. Just if you look in the paper, you'll see that when they did look at autism, there's only one database where they found autism. The other databases are much smaller, A and B. They are looking at only autism-like symptoms, which that's not autism. That's held constant in the population at about 6% for a long time. It's definitely not 6 or 7%. It's definitely not autism. All right, so we're going to move along now to talk about temporal correlations. And temporal, again, these are associations in time. They don't prove anything, but if you have no association in time, then you can rule things out. Well, if acetaminophen has only been in use for 5 years, but autism has been around for 30, we can rule out acetaminophen. Right? That's how it works. But if the associations in time pan out, then there is opportunity. Back to our means, motive, and opportunity. So the timing is right. The autism really started to increase about birth cohort 1980 when the medical profession switched from aspirin due to concerns over Reye syndrome to acetaminophen. And acetaminophen, are a molecule that gets processed by your body to make acetaminophen, had been in use in medicine since 1886. So it's just wasn't that popular. Children were exposed to it. Autism was discovered by a Soviet, or something that apparently was autism was discovered by a female Soviet scientist in the 1920s, and then rediscovered by Asperger and Connor in the 1940s. So it was around, but it just wasn't that common. Then I think a big push is this correlation with direct-to-consumer advertising. This is when we became much more, already in the 80s, we were fairly medicated. We, being the Western world, especially in the US, we're a medicated society. And reading the writings at that time of people that were in charge of the healthcare system, you could tell people are using too many drugs, more drugs than we need. But that just accelerated with direct-to-consumer advertising at the same time that autism spectrum disorder, the prevalence increased dramatically. So there's lines of evidence number 9 and 10. There's a line of evidence number 11, which has to do with, and I apologize, this slide is slightly distorted, but you can still see what's going on, is that there's a switch from there's a switch towards regressive autism. So you've got more infantile autism, and then birth cohort 1980, more regressive autism. This data was collected by the Autism Research Institute at that time. What it's telling us is that there was something introduced in the population that could induce autism even after months or years of development. And of course, that would be the pediatric use of acetaminophen based on the other 24 lines of evidence that we have. So we're going to move on now to the prevalence of autism in places that don't have acetaminophen. Now, this is one that's tricky, because you can say, well, maybe it's just nobody's measured it there, but it's people who have been boots on the ground in places looking for autism, talking to people, trying to find autism where they don't have abundant modern medicine, have a difficult time finding it. And I think here we talk about Cuba. We thank Bill Shaw for pointing us toward that one. And then there's other studies, and those are cited here that, well, we cite one of our reviews here, and you can find there's a lot of details in these that are in the review. So there's no point in putting dozens of references on each slide here, but you can find an overall summary in that review published in Life. And I think one of the biggest findings was in Nicaragua in 2010. So even though you can't measure the prevalence of autism spectrum disorder in these countries, there's just no way to do it, but you can, and what was done, you can measure the ratio of something, for example, Down syndrome to autism in a school for special needs children. And that's exactly what was done. And then what they find is, if you use Down syndrome as a baseline, so Down syndrome is a genetic condition, it's caused strictly by alteration in the genes during development, use that as a baseline, what you'll see is that autism just is, for the most part, missing in those cultures. So it agrees with a lot of other evidence that we have. We've also done extensive historical readings of clinicians who were very, very competent in the 1970s, 1980s, trying to figure out, why is the prevalence of autism increasing? And you read what they're saying in the 1980s, when it was crossing the, say, 1 in 1,500 mark, saying, why is it going up? We are doing a good job of assessing this. So people have for a long time been concerned that it's going up, and they've been paying particularly good attention to the methods that they're using when they monitor this, right? So it's really telling us that this is not something that's always been with us, and we're just now seeing it. That really does not add up. And again, how do you explain the other evidence I've shown you? For example, twofold difference in infantile autism with circumcision. So there's just so much that you can't explain with this idea that it's always been here and nothing's really specific is causing it. Line of evidence number 13, very interesting, shows that acetaminophen, you could, in terms of means, motive, and opportunity, you could say this is the motive. I mean, obviously drugs don't have a motive, but this drug likes, if you will, put that in quote marks, likes to, for whatever reason, affect the social centers, social awareness in the brain. That's what happens in adults. It's temporary. But then, you see that effect long term in people with autism spectrum disorder. That is a huge indicator right there that this is probably what's going on, right? Just this one alone tells you this should be evaluated. And then with the other lines of evidence, we can be conclusive about it. Well, there's a paper that just asking the question, based on all this evidence, it seems to be a social analgesic. So I'll let you read this one. It's basically saying that acetaminophen does cause inflammation, and then that can become a vicious cycle. And again, we know that it doesn't cause enough inflammation by itself to be a problem, but if you have other factors which are causing inflammation, then it can be a problem, and in fact is a problem for the developing brain. All right, let's go to talk a little bit about the laboratory animals. This is what my lab does. There's 5 different laboratories working on this at the present time. The references are here. You can look those up. I think Henrik Viberg did this amazing set of experiments in laboratory animals. He gave his mice roughly the same dose. It was a little bit more, but with acetaminophen, you can give repeated doses, and especially if the child has problem metabolizing it, the concentration will build up to probably somewhere right around what Henrik Viberg was using, which was 30 milligram per kilogram. It's all weight adjusted, of course. He looked at laboratory mice. Now, what you can see, if you look at that top graph, what you can see there is that a normal mouse with just 2 days of training can learn to run a maze really fast. And if you look at the bottom graph, they run it faster and faster because they just don't make any mistakes. And you already can see the results here. If you just give them 2 doses of acetaminophen, this is later in life, they cannot run, they just can't learn. They don't get faster, they don't stop making mistakes. All right, so that's in laboratory mice. This is a study that came out of my lab while I was at Duke University showing changes, and we gave laboratory rats less than, on a mg per kg basis, ours was around 12 to 13 milligram per kilogram, and you're allowed to give newborn babies, 15 milligram, 14.7 to be precise, milligram per kilogram. And we gave them about 20% less than that. And you still see here long-term changes, just a big shift in this behavior that's associated with stress when they meet a new social partner. So and normally rats are like dogs or like humans, they like to play when they're young, and these rats were showing signs of stress. And the only difference is that the control rats, with scientific control, they were given just a solution that didn't contain acetaminophen. The other rats were given the solution with acetaminophen when they were newborns. So again, if the FDA is looking at this in a modern system, they would look at this, they would look at Viberg's study, and they would say, nope, you cannot even use this experimentally in a baby. You can't do it because you have these long-term problems. It's considered a major adverse event. So you just can't use it. It would not pass modern drug testing. That's just a fact based on the studies I just showed you. One thing to think about is that laboratory rats are super, super healthy, and so are the mice. This is a graph that is decades old. It's basically saying that if you don't feed the rat for a couple of meals, then acetaminophen gets much more dangerous. So you can imagine what happens when you've got a child that is sick and can't keep down food. They get taken to the hospital. They're behind on their vaccines, by the way, so they get a lot of vaccines, but they also get a lot of acetaminophen. And most pediatricians don't. Some do. Most don't realize that if you're not holding down food, it does make acetaminophen much more dangerous. This is a study in laboratory animals, the one I'm showing you here. This little table is showing you how many vitamins we give to our laboratory rats. It's just amazing. It's 30, almost 40 times more than the U.S. recommended daily allowance for humans, and of all the different B vitamins. And those B vitamins are the ones that are helping to metabolize acetaminophen, some especially folate, the one that's highlighted there in yellow. So lots of excess B vitamins, super healthy animals. They're bred to be super healthy under laboratory conditions. And it's, again, between 8 and 45 times more B vitamins, with especially the folate is the big one. That's the one that is directly in the pathway helping to metabolize acetaminophen, and it's almost 40 times more than the U.S. recommended daily allowance. So there's a very interesting study, and we're still looking at point number 14 here. There's a very interesting study that was published back in the 80s showing that if you give a rat pup so much acetaminophen that it kills it, it still doesn't affect the liver. So and of course you put that together with Henrik Weiber's work, with my studies and my work, and other laboratories as well. We know that the drug acetaminophen is affecting the brain, and this study back in the 1980s is showing it doesn't affect the liver. So it doesn't do the same thing to a baby that it does to an adult. And by 33 days of age, if you look at these data carefully, it's saying by 33 days of age, which for a rat, that means they're getting pretty grown up. They're almost the same as, say, a 4-year-old, 5-year-old child. Then by then the rat will suffer liver damage, not brain damage. But they didn't see liver damage in the neonatal or newborn rats up to 11 days of age. So the acute studies, and when we see acute study, there you give a huge dose of acetaminophen, enough to kill the laboratory animal. And those, in adults, it takes, and one study showed, almost 4 grams, 3,700 milligram per kilogram. And when people looked at this back in the 1970s, they thought, wow, that's we're only giving a baby 15 milligram per kilogram, so why should we worry about this? This is so big of a difference between what kills a rat and what we're giving the baby that we really don't have to worry about it. But what we found, and this data, this unpublished data, this is the only unpublished data I'll show you, and I have Dr. Reisner's permission. She's a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She and I work together on this, and what we see is that the rats will stop nursing and then die. That's a similar effect to what you see with alcohol during development in laboratory animals. It affects their nursing behavior. So it's definitely having profound effects on basic social functions, in this case, a nursing behavior, at relatively low doses. This was 150 milligram per kilogram, and it depends on the litter. We have seen even lower doses affect nursing behavior. So it's not as safe as people in the 1970s, certainly not as safe as people in the 1970s thought, based on work in adult laboratory rats. And rats are much more resistant to acetaminophen than mice and humans. So it was just a mistake from the get-go, and I'll talk to you more about that later with another line of evidence. So we're still in laboratory animals, but we're going to move to a new line of evidence here. This line of evidence deals with the male-female ratio in autism, and what you see in mice and in rats. And Peg McCarthy works in the laboratory rats, and Brandon works in laboratory mice. And in both cases, males are more sensitive to the drug than females are, because it's just a difference in sex. And of course, with autism spectrum disorder, it's more predominant in males, and it does tend to be underdiagnosed in females, but even with that, it's much more prevalent in males. So this is still in laboratory animals, but it's something that tells us about how acetaminophen damages the brain. It's in adult rats, but what it shows is that it will literally kill neurons in the brain at doses lower than it kills the liver. So really nice study by a very prominent professor in Italy. It explains a lot about some of the genetic associations with acetaminophen, and how if we can't repair damage, that it can be associated with autism. And this study is showing how that damage is incurred and what happens when acetaminophen reaches the brain. So number 17 is we're no longer we're talking about veterinary medicine now. We're not talking about laboratory animals. And I mentioned before that cats cannot be given acetaminophen. Most cat owners and certainly all veterinarians know about this. And it has to do with this glucuronidation pathway that newborns don't have. It doesn't kick in until several days later after birth. And cats also don't have it. And that's a very important pathway for safe processing of acetaminophen. I'm going to talk a little bit about these kind of associations in space, right? So, or in different populations. So we already talked about number 5, line of evidence number 5, which dealt with circumcision, dealt with what's going on in Israel, where you get the Orthodox versus Reformed Jews and big differences in prevalence of autism there. And you've got 18 and 19 deal with 2 different situations. One in South Korea, where they had to shut down, this is about 2012, had to shut down drug manufacturing of acetaminophen, children's acetaminophen, because there was too much active ingredient. And they looked for liver failure, but didn't see anything. But they had these incredibly high rates of autism spectrum disorder and did not understand why. So then if you compare Denmark and Finland, you also see, and this is between 2006 and 2010, it's changed since then because of use of acetaminophen keeps going up. You compare Denmark and Finland and you see that the amount of acetaminophen that is used in the country is very proportional to the amount of autism spectrum disorder that's found in the country. And otherwise unexplained, just associations, but they, of course, are explained by the connection between acetaminophen and autism. So we're going to move on to line of evidence number 20. I will spend quite a bit of time on line of evidence number 20. I think it's certainly one that has garnered a lot of the media's attention. There's still a tremendous amount of misinformation about this line of evidence. And one of the main issues that I want to point out here is that this seems to be one of the blind spots in our understanding of medicine. It deals repeatedly with autism spectrum disorder, and the parents' observations have repeatedly been extremely telling and provided these massive clues when we listen. So about 50%, it depends on the study, sometimes it's as low as 30%, but it's a very large number of parents who have a child with autism believe that, based on their observations, vaccination had something to do with their child's autism spectrum disorder. But we know that vaccines by themselves can't do it, and there's some studies that are cited here. And of course, I've already talked about the Schultz study that was earlier on. It shows that it was the acetaminophen given with the vaccine, not the vaccine itself. So the standard story is that there's a guy named Andy Wakefield who published a study. And if you look at the title of that study, most people cannot understand that title. Right now, of course, I've been in the field of medicine for 30 years, so I can understand the title because I've had extensive training, but that title really doesn't relate to most people. And I can tell you that one paper really does not change public opinion, or I would not be giving this lecture right now. But the bottom line is that the standard story is that this paper is to blame, and the press that followed this paper of getting people concerned about vaccines causing autism. So this is really not what's going on. It's a huge misinformation alert. The actual case report itself never said that vaccination causes autism, only that there's an association in some of the children. So you've got a case report of 12 people. It's not placebo controlled. It's not blinded. Nothing I'm talking about today is placebo controlled and blinded. So it's just an association, right? In selected children. So parents are telling the story that, hey, it's basically the same thing that the neighbor down the street or your family member will tell you, at least in my case, that, hey, this is what I saw. So I've been to conferences where 1,000 different people will all say that, yep, this is what happened to my kid. So it's not hard to imagine that he found 12 cases where this happened. So interestingly, he did not, but he was asked to retract the interpretation that there's no causal link was established. Now, if you read the paper, that's not what the paper says. So they were asked to retract something that the paper didn't actually say, which is very interesting. It tells you that, okay, there's more than just science going on here. And of course, there was concern from public health officials that this paper was causing people not to vaccinate. So I think it's a tragic situation. Had we, the medical community, really just looked at this and said, well, okay, could there be something really going on here? It would have been traced back, obviously, now we know, to acetaminophen, but that's not what happened. And what happened was, well, it shows you here what happened. The paper was fully retracted based on the claims that the children were consecutively referred. So, I mean, he acknowledges that his colleagues would say, hey, here's a case, but send it over to Andy because, this looks like one of his cases. So they were sent to him by his colleagues, and he wrote up the 12 similar cases. That's normally how you do a case report. And then he did pass initial investigations that the ethics board approval was okay, but then eventually, with repeated investigation, they decided that he didn't do that to their satisfaction. So it doesn't say that what he saw was incorrect or that anything they reported was incorrect, but that he somehow didn't follow the rules correctly. So this of course antagonized a lot of individuals who were saying the same thing. Hey, I took my kid to get vaccinated, and they've got autism. So then it proceeded from there to he was accused of falsifying data, and it's just basically it's getting worse and worse. It's looking worse and worse for Andrew Wakefield. He was eventually struck off and lost his medical license. So one of his colleagues who refused to engage in the retraction process also lost his license, but got that back upon appeal because there was apparently the board found that there was no reason to remove the license. But as I understand it, Dr. Wakefield did not appeal. So this is a quote, and it's, I think, sort of mainstream thinking that it's what the parents are seeing is just, and here I use the word predestined. Well, you regress into autism about the same time you're getting vaccinated anyway, which is not what the parents are reporting. They're reporting that their child gets very, very sick when they get the vaccination, and then they just don't come out of that. So the parents just don't accept this story very well, if at all. And I think we need to really look back at the history of medicine and autism to see why the parents just do not trust the system. And it also tells us that what's going on now is just this, it's really the same song, third verse of a blind spot that we have that desperately needs to be resolved. So when we look back at the history, what we'll come to is early on in the 1940s, the American that discovered autism spectrum disorder, and again, there's a Soviet female clinician had described it in the 1920s, but that was essentially forgotten. So rediscovered by Connor. 1943, he basically started what's known as a refrigerator mother hypothesis. And then a guy named Bruno Bettelheim pushed it forward. He was a bit advocate for it, that it was cold parenting that was causing autism spectrum disorder. So I won't spend a lot of time on this. You can pause and read the slides if you want to, but it was an individual named Bernie Rimlin who finally overcame that in 1964. So this held sway for about 20 years, that the parents were blamed for autism spectrum disorder. And then this idea that it was innate, which is another mistake, came into play. In other words, and by innate, you're just born with it. It's habit. It's part of you. It's not induced. You developed with it, similar to, say, Down syndrome or something of that nature. So in 2005, it was finally shown that yes, you could actually regress into autism. So, and that's so many years when parents were told, no, it's not possible that your child regresses. It's definitely innate. So again, a tremendous amount of animosity among the community of parents who have a child with autism against the medical community, which is based on these kinds of blind spots or misunderstanding among the medical community. So finally, it was resolved in 2005 that yes, a child can regress into autism. And if you don't really understand where autism comes from, this creates a complexity that is very hard to explain. So, how can the same condition happen in a 3-year-old and in a newborn? But of course, once you understand what I'm talking about today and the role of acetaminophen, then everything makes perfect sense. And this is another example of a confirmation bias that was overcome by Geraldine Dawson. She says, no, it really can happen when you're older, when you're 2 or 3 years old. And regressive autism can happen up to the age of about 5. But so far as is known, probably 6 years old and up, not so much. So back to our original line of evidence, then the parents' observations they're seeing something real, and it's a clue. It's telling us the same thing that Schultz's study is telling us, that something is going on at the time that you give a vaccine. And of course, it's not the vaccine itself. It is the acetaminophen associated with a vaccine. So the parents' observations support the other lines of evidence. It's sort of giving us a common denominator that acetaminophen is at the root of this. And of course, the parents are strongly encouraged to use acetaminophen. Most people think of acetaminophen as absolutely safe, to the point that, unfortunately, a lot of individuals, both in the hospital, one study showed in the hospital and at home, 14% of all administrations of acetaminophen were technically overdoses. And people ask me, well, is it the overdose or is the actual, just can a normal dose of acetaminophen also induce autism? And of course, what the answer is, it's a combination of the amount of acetaminophen and the susceptibility of the person at the time that they're exposed to acetaminophen. So if you're extremely susceptible due to a combination of environment and genetics and other factors, then it takes less acetaminophen. If you're less susceptible, it takes more acetaminophen. So we go on to the next line of evidence. This is from the same Schultz study, and I've mentioned before he was looking at the vaccination, specifically at the MMR vaccine. Now, MMR it's a live vaccine. It doesn't have the kind of chemicals in it, the mercury and the aluminum, that some people think might be associated with autism. It's just the vaccine, and what he found was that it's not the vaccine that's the problem. Now, before I showed you data that had nothing to do from the Schultz study, I showed you data that had nothing to do with vaccination. Just if you use acetaminophen, you have 20 times more regressive autism. So it's actually not as strong of an association if you consider the vaccine. That takes away some of the association. But there still is an association. If you have a bad reaction to the MMR vaccine and use acetaminophen, you're more likely to have autism, a child with autism, than if you just have a bad reaction to the vaccine, but don't use acetaminophen. So it's all telling us the same thing. Now, line of evidence number 22 is a study that we did while at Duke, and it had a huge impact on basically all of the science that we're doing, because there were literally thousands of papers in the medical literature, thousands, and we looked at every single one of them that said this drug is safe in babies or children when used as directed. So the question is, how this is coming to be. So it's possible to track that down, and you use what's called a systematic review method, and then you use another thing called citation tracking, which means that you look at all of these studies. It was declared safe. People are, and there's a quote from Barry Rumack, who's a very prominent pediatrician, still active today. They were looking for liver damage in children and not seeing it. So, but they weren't looking, obviously, for long-term kinds of effects involving something such as autism or any kind of hyperactivity disorder or developmental delays. They were looking strictly at liver function. And as you probably guessed, that's what we found when we did our study. So we had a great team led by a professor who works in the field of information science, digging into, and these are a bunch of students that worked with us on the project. We were very grateful to them. I know it was not a fun project. And, sometimes we do projects that are just not fun, and digging through thousands of papers to find out why they think something is safe it's not part of the fun of science, but it's absolutely, in this case, critical, because we need to know. If everybody thinks it's safe, then we need to have a solid anchor point in the scientific literature that says everybody thinks it's safe. Not everybody, but thousands of people writing in the scientific literature think it's safe. Why do they think it's safe? So again, we use this process called citation tracking. So you find one paper, and the paper, you see that little blue speck, and it's not important to read this. The point is that's a single paper, and then all those lines that go out from that blue box, those are all the papers that are referenced by that paper. And then if it has a check mark by it, it's basically a dead end. It means, okay, it's either a study that was done, or it's just a study that said it was safe but provides no evidence whatsoever. Or then other papers can come out from that paper. That if you say the first paper there references a paper, if you follow it to the left, you'll see there's another paper there, and that references another paper, which references two more papers, which are what we call primary sources. They're not referencing anybody else. So the ones with the green check marks don't reference anybody else. They're a primary source. And on the left there, you see there's a little diagram that's a length of time of follow-up. And the length of time of follow-up, the median, I think, was only a day or two. It was not long at all. So they're just looking for liver damage. And repeatedly we saw that. They're looking for liver damage. And that's basically why we decided it was safe, is because it doesn't, but it's, again, and we looked at the laboratory animal studies earlier. You can kill a neonatal laboratory animal without hurting its liver with acetaminophen. So it was just a tragic mistake. And I've given a lecture about this at Duke University to just a number of professors, and the big question was, well, who's the villain in all of this? And the answer is, I don't know. I do not know that there is a villain in all of this. It was just a tragic mistake, as far as we can tell. So the case of cystic, we're going to go ahead and move on to line of evidence number 23. Only one left to go after this one. But as a reminder, on line of evidence number 2, there's all these different things, genetic, epigenetic, that are associated with autism, because they make acetaminophen more difficult to process. So they just make it more dangerous. Now, in the case of cystic fibrosis is the exception to this. It is associated with oxidative stress, and you can go back and read the original literature on this, why we think that cystic fibrosis appears to be protective against autism spectrum disorder, and it's because people with cystic fibrosis are super metabolizers of acetaminophen. There's a compensatory mechanism going on in their body trying to compensate for the genetic problem that's causing the cystic fibrosis itself, the symptoms of cystic fibrosis. So it's documented in the literature that they are extremely efficient. The individuals with cystic fibrosis are extremely efficient at metabolizing acetaminophen. So just a kind of remarkable, and then it's these little odd things that provide good clues that tell us what's going on. All right, final line of evidence is, and this is, I love this line of evidence because it incisively answers a question that I got to ask all the time. It said, Dr. Parker, how in the world can you think that a single drug is causing a whole spectrum of disorders? Well, it's already known. It's called fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. A single drug can cause a spectrum of disorders, and it does happen. It's well documented and there's a list of similarities here. We published this in Life magazine. The references there are, well, Life, the journal Life, not Life magazine. And you can read through those, but the bottom line is really the big difference between fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and autism spectrum disorder is when suspicion was first raised about alcohol, it was accepted without any problem, no problem at all. But when Schultz first raised suspicion about acetaminophen, then, confirmation bias, probably coupled with a kind of bias called consensus bias. Hey, everybody says this is okay, so it must be okay. And certainly there was some emotional compromise. It's difficult to accept that we've made sometimes such a huge mistake or a mistake of this magnitude. So the big difference between fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and autism spectrum disorder, other than, some issues with, one is, affects males more than the other, one is induced by alcohol, the others are induced by a different drug. The main difference is that people just accepted that alcohol is dangerous, and people are having a difficult time accepting that that acetaminophen is dangerous. So the two spectrum disorders are very, very similar in many regards otherwise. So this doesn't show how it happens, how a single drug can cause a spectrum of disorders, but it shows that it does happen. So it answers the question, well, it does happen. So it's not unreasonable to think that it can happen with acetaminophen. All right, now that's the end of the evidence, and we've published, all of this is published work except for the one study I showed you. We're working with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill on, where I am a visiting scholar. So we'll go on to our conclusions now. There's, what we call overwhelming evidence from, so many associations in time without explanation otherwise, as well as the clinical and medical studies and the studies in laboratory animal models. So this is from a paper that we published in a journal called Children. It's an MDPI journal, and it basically shows you what we think is sort of the timing of sensitivity. And as I mentioned earlier, there's a big spike right at birth. That's when sensitivity goes way up, and then around age 4 or 5, it dissipates by age 6. Then we don't think the ability to induce autism spectrum disorder still exists for acetaminophen. And we're not sure about the timing during pregnancy. That's just the sensitivity during pregnancy. That is a tricky question. There's no reason to go into a lot of detail, but it's difficult to know with any certainty what's going on there. We just don't know. So our conclusions, which we published in the scientific literature repeatedly now, I think 3 times so far, with different amounts of evidence. I showed you that in an earlier slide before we started the evidence, are that the drug is dangerous, and in combination with a lot of other things that create sensitivity, it is inducing autism spectrum disorder. And the paper in Children has 22 of the 24 lines of evidence in it. So we don't have absolute proof. Say, people ask me, well, what would you need for absolute proof? I mean, don't we need to get absolute proof? And the answer is no, we don't even think it's ethical. You would have to run a placebo-controlled, which you can't really do with acetaminophen because it so effectively reduces a fever that you would know if you were on placebo or not, which defeats the purpose of the placebo. You need to run a placebo-controlled, blinded trial, and there's ethical problems with running a blinded trial with acetaminophen from conception to age 5, which would be wildly expensive. You would have to do it in tens of thousands of children. And plus, if you've got so much evidence already to tell you this drug is bad, there's no reason to expose any children to it just for the sake of experimenting on them. That's just immoral. It's unethical. That could never float. So the bottom line is that if you look at Occam's razor, there's all of these things that have to be true if acetaminophen is not inducing autism and spectrum disorder. So, and as I showed you earlier, there's a corollary to Occam's razor that there's so many things that makes the alternative explanation just not just less likely, it makes it just kind of ridiculous. This is a summary of the timeline. I think one thing that'll jump out at you here is that as you look down through here, you'll see that, yeah, okay, Connor and Bettelheim really messed up with the refrigerator mother hypothesis. And it was Bernie Rimland in the mid-1960s which said, no, that's not it, and had a lot to do with undermining that hypothesis. Then in the 1970s, the medical profession decided that acetaminophen is safe for babies and children. That's in I've got Barry Rumack there, but he was just looking at consensus among his colleagues. That was not his decision alone, obviously. But then soon after that, aspirin was associated with Reye syndrome, began to climb. And then Wakefield's study came out before the medical establishment realized that regressive autism could happen. And then there's a picture of Rimland again. That's the same Bernie Rimland so he carried all his clout from undermining the refrigerator mother hypothesis. The same Bernie Rimland there. It's in 1965. It's the same one in 2000 who said, it looks like, and he was just listening to parents. He said, you really need to look at the vaccine. So he lost tremendous amount of credibility there, and just a tragic case of a missed opportunity, because had they been looking at the acetaminophen, they would have found, and you see the Schultz study there. It was about 10 years after the Wakefield study when Schultz showed that among parents who were biased and think that a vaccine caused their child's autism, it was the acetaminophen. So, and then since then, the vast amount of evidence has just kept piling up, telling us that it is. When I started working on this, not a single study had been done in laboratory animal models. So, it's just so much evidence now has piled up that it's at the point of, we really shouldn't be talking about this. We should be doing something about it. We'll take a step back and we'll look at the big picture now. It's, again, not just acetaminophen. It's a whole bunch of stuff that adds up. And earlier I showed you, some examples of individuals' capacities to handle toxins, and illustrated by a cup. And when you pile a lot of stuff in that cup, it can't handle that much acetaminophen. So that's the overall model. It's not just acetaminophen that is causing autism. It's acetaminophen in susceptible babies and children, and possibly prenatally to some extent. Why do we think that it is mostly after you cut the umbilical cord? Well, that was the big change in medical practice. Number one, that started in the early 1980s because of the Reye syndrome and abandoning aspirin. Now, that's not entirely true, because direct-to-consumer advertising also affected everyone. Pregnant women using acetaminophen as well presumably went up during that time period. So it's still, we're not sure that nothing happens during pregnancy. And based on the toxicology and pharmacokinetics of acetaminophen, we know that it's right when you clamp that umbilical cord, that's the worst time to get exposed to the drug. That's part of it. And then, of course, some of that evidence, if you go back and comb through that evidence, a lot of that evidence is really pointing, some of it you can't tell whether it's prenatal or postnatal, but some of it really is specific for after that umbilical cord is cut. So it's not just giving it to a newborn, it's also how much is given during labor and delivery. So you've got almost two entirely different groups of medical doctors that need to consider what's going on with acetaminophen. That'd be the people that are delivering babies and the people that are treating babies. So two different medical communities, essentially. I'm going to give you a summary here. I'm not going to read through the whole thing. It will just point out and re-emphasize this first one. That we are not saying that acetaminophen by itself causes autism spectrum disorder. That is ridiculous, because then almost everybody would have autism spectrum disorder, because most people now, the vast majority, during childhood are exposed to that drug. But it's also an issue of susceptibility. There was just a really unfortunate paper published German language only by some clinicians and said, no, this can't be. It's just ridiculous to think that one drug could cause this problem. And then they went on to it's difficult to describe how they tried to take apart our model. It would just suffice to say there was no valid scientific statements that were made in trying to take apart our conclusions. So the question now is what to do about it. Well, we can't give medical recommendations to individuals. None of us are medical doctors on the team. We have neuroscientists, we have toxicologists, pharmacologists. I'm an immunologist, biochemist. We cannot make medical recommendations to individuals, but we can recommend guidelines for clinical practice to physicians, which is what we do in the peer-reviewed published literature. And you'll see the guidelines aren't that shocking. And the bottom line is acetaminophen has never been shown to save a single human life. And since we're extremely confident now that it is causing a vast number of severe adverse events, autism spectrum disorder, then the choices that need to be made are fairly straightforward. And I won't read through all of those here. Those are published in the paper published recently in the journal Children. So part of the problem still is that we believe the drug is good. Advertising is effective. That's why drug companies spend so much money advertising just for acetaminophen. The primary manufacturer spent almost $500 million, that's inflation adjusted, per year, marketing that during some years in the 1990s. So that is just for one drug. So it's very effective. That's why they spend the money on it, and it convinces you that if you're a good parent, you will give this to your baby. So we're not saying that, again, who's the criminal here? It's certainly not the parents who've been told that if you're a good parent, you will give this drug to your baby. The question is then, well, how do you treat a fever? And we can't give medical advice. And, maybe we don't need to treat a fever, right? You can't use less acetaminophen. And scientific studies show if you drop the amount of acetaminophen, it just doesn't work anymore. That's what this graph shows you. And the bottom line is there's probably just no reason to treat the vast majority of fevers. All right. And then furthermore, you probably have a good reason not to treat the fever, since they are part of the body's immune response here. And the citations are here. In the book that I pointed out earlier, Blind Spots by Marty Makery, he talks about this. There's a section on why do we think we need to block something which is protective. It's part of your immune system's response to help fight an infection. And then on top of that, we really don't know. There's no evidence. Let's put it that way. There's no evidence that if you've got something dangerous going on in your brain, say an infection in the brain, which is very, very serious, there's no reason to think that acetaminophen would be helpful under those circumstances. And studies show that, for example, with febrile seizures, you don't see an effect from acetaminophen. And there's even a question whether febrile seizures are even dangerous, because there's, as far as we can tell, no lasting effects from those. So there's a lot of ways to treat a fever without pharmaceuticals. We are not saying don't go see your medical doctor. This is very important. a fever can indicate that something bad is wrong, such as an infection in the brain or a tumor growth. So if your child has something unusual beyond just a regular aches and pains from a cold, then it is very, very important to go see a doctor. We would never encourage people not to do that because it can cause a loss of life, not from a fever, as far as scientific evidence tells us, but from other things that are associated with fever. So that's why you need to go see a doctor when something is going on with your child that is not usual. It's not just the average fevers, aches, and pains that all children get. We have a lot of information on the web about how to, and we're not giving medical advice, but we just link out to other people who are talking about this is how you do these things without using a medication if you should choose to do so. And just so much information out there that's extremely helpful. And it's a challenge because it's easy to go to the bottle. That's the bottom line. It's easy to go to the bottle, but it is, as we've shown, that is problematic going to the bottle with acetaminophen in it. And with that, I'd like to close up and thank so many people. I worked almost 28 years at Duke University, and tremendous number of friends and colleagues there that I know and love. And then, of course, WP Lab is our private nonprofit that we've been focused on since I retired from Duke about 4 years ago. And then a number of other individuals that have been extremely helpful, especially Kate Reisner, in whose lab I work right now, still looking at the effects of acetaminophen on laboratory animals. And with that, we will close it up, and thank you very much. Please visit our website and contact us if you have any questions, comments. Sometimes we get people looking at, can he really be right about this? And they'll find additional evidence that helps us. And of course, if somebody does find, we're always looking for new evidence. And if somebody finds alternative explanations, which up to this point nobody has, at this point it seems very, very clear what's going on. But we're willing to listen. And that's the whole point of science. You're willing to listen, willing to hear alternative ideas. And I thank you very much for your attention.